Hey, everybody, I'm going to be in Dallas, Austin, and Houston, Texas, March 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, and I hope to see you there. I'll do a presentation, we'll have some Q&A, we'll hang out together. It's going to be a great time. All the details on my website, so check them out now at sethandrews.net/events.
Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
Dr. Valerie Tarico is a psychologist. She's an author. She's a social commentator. She talks about issues like religious fundamentalism and gender roles and family planning and other issues. She's written for publications like Alternate and the Huffington Post. She's the author of 2 books. I think that's right. I know she's written Trusting Doubt, a former evangelical looks at old beliefs in a new light. Tell me about your latest book real fast, Dr. Tarico. The title of it is...
Dias and Other Imaginings was my second book. It's actually quite different in that it's a bunch of folk tales that I wrote for my daughters when they were young, and my editor found out about it and asked if she could turn it into a real book.
Fantastic stuff. You can find the entire archive of her work on her website, ValerieTarico.com. Valerie, my friend, it's good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me back.
I guess I switched back from Valerie to Dr. Tarico. We're friends, but I want to respect the title and your education and experience here, you know.
Okay, either way.
Okay. Well, you know, it's weird being an activist in the age of the internet. You know, different people can look at the exact same thing and then they'll come away with a totally different take on it. And, you know, I've been an activist, an atheist activist for the past decade, and I feel like I've heard it all. You know, people start mashing away at the comment sections whenever we talk about whatever subject grazes their delicate nerves, and then opinions split. And it often seems to be kind of a binary thing. And I want to get into that with you and see what your experience is. But let me do a short setup. We recently did a show with Dr. Hector Garcia. We were talking about masculinity as a positive, but we were also dealing with masculine tendencies that may speak to our evolution that might not be helpful or productive. And people all of a sudden freaked out, and there was that divide. On one side, hey, Seth, you're just a regressive leftist vilifying all things male and masculine. Other people on the other side were saying I'm too lenient on these knuckle draggers, these men in society who've screwed up the entire world. We've talked about things like feminism. Somehow after that show, I was both an advocate for women and an anti-woman megaphone for white male privilege. How this happened, I do not know. We talk about specific words or symbols or players in the Trump administration. At the end of that conversation, I am somehow both a Kool-Aid drinking leftist, regressive leftist, and also an alt-right apologist for conservative bigots. I mean, you say anything, anywhere, and there's this weird division followed by, in many cases, kind of a public tarring and feathering by what I call an extremist purity cult that seems to accept nothing less than 1,000% alignment with whatever their subjective ideas or positions are. And if you fail their test, well, look out, because they're going to have a public trial and likely a public execution. You wrote an article. It's on your website. I'll link it in the description box. It's called The Righteous and the Woke: Why Evangelicals and Social Justice Warriors Trigger Me in the Same Way. Okay, well, that's kind of a loaded title. So talk to me about why you wrote it. What triggered this?
Well, so you maybe know that I have a background as an evangelical Christian. That's how I spent my youth. I'm a graduate of Wheaton College of Billy Graham fame. And I've spent much of the last decade writing articles that are both critical of evangelicalism, biblical literalism, and supportive of secularism, and also that are supportive of the process that people go through in coming out of toxic religious experiences. And I'm also have been at that same time a very active member of the left and working almost full time, sometimes for months on end, to help build progressive infrastructure here in my home, Washington State. And yet the more I kind of gotten deeply involved, the more I feel like this community of activists has been changing in ways that really remind me of the evangelical community that I left behind.
You and I are both proud liberals. Like, I don't start out saying, I'm going to be liberal on this. I just look at my value system and my positions on things like choice and right to die and legalization of drugs and, whatever, the role of government. And I just find that liberal best describes me. Would that be accurate for your case?
That would be accurate for me, too.
Okay.
And so it's interesting that I find myself so often in a tug of war with people who also describe themselves as liberal. It's not because I'm skewing to the right. I find what's going on the right appalling. I think that the purity tests within the Republican Party have essentially stripped out moderate conservatives and principled conservatives to the point that the party has become this cesspool of racism and corporatism and, kind of like all those things that the right gets accused of by the left. There's a lot of basis.
It's interesting. I saw a tweet from Melissa Milano, who I love and admire. It essentially said that the Make America Great Again red ball cap is the 21st century's Klan hood, symbol of the KKK. And I'm not a Trump fan, and I'm surrounded by people who are bigoted people who love Trump. I know that racism exists, bigotry exists, but I went online hoping against hope for sort of a measure of nuance and said, is it fair to say that everyone who wears the hat is essentially a member of the KKK? And I had failed a purity test, right? I had not gone along with this sort of hard line that had been set in place. And I was astounded by just the sheer volume that had come back in response, this indignation that was really in many ways a righteous sounding indignation. Do you have any thoughts on that kind of thing?
Well, that's why I wrote the title, The Righteous and the Woke, right? I mean, Christians see themselves as the righteous, but there is this incredible degree of righteousness on the left these days. And the sense that there isn't room for any nuance or complexity or disagreement, any of those things put you somehow into this camp of evildoers, which then kind of the term racist gets thrown around very, very loosely, very liberally, if you will. But yeah, I knew as soon as you told that story, I knew what the punchline was going to be, and it's crazy.
I mean, I wasn't excusing the blind, often white nationalism. I wasn't saying that I in any way support the guy. I'm just thinking, isn't there a measure of intellectual honesty that requires that we look at these things as complex issues?
Well, and, part of why I feel so concerned about this, pained about it, to be perfectly honest, is that I feel like the right has gone off the rails. There are legitimate arguments to be made for a more streamlined government. We can debate honestly what kinds of regulations are needed and which kinds are unnecessarily burdensome. We can kind of debate honestly what kind of immigration policies make sense or how we best help people get a step up out of poverty. But when we can't have nuance or complexity on either side that matches the complexity of our world, then I think we're at a loss for solutions. And I've been, frankly, counting on the left to provide a reality base, right? I mean, I used to say that reality had a left-leaning bias. and by last year, I found myself saying reality may have a left-leaning bias, but leftists no longer seem to have a reality bias.
Do you draw a distinction between left and liberal or leftist and liberal?
Well, I honestly hadn't until recently, realizing, of course, that there is this sort of classical liberalism that some libertarians claim as their heritage. But I've thought of this kind of broad enterprise, the Enlightenment enterprise, and the kind of the emergence of social democracy, the idea that we both need to be able to kind of support individual freedoms, that people flourish best when we kind of honor and support individual freedoms, and also when we recognize that our actions individually and collectively have an impact on other people, so that there is in fact a need for us to have a way to do the things together that we can't very well do alone, and set limits on bad behavior and things like that. It's all seemed to me like that was what the left represented to me. And what I experience emerging more and more clearly over the last 5 years is a different kind of left, which has really, as some kind of right-wing people have pointed out, it does have its roots in a kind of neo-Marxist analysis of society. And what that means is kind of seeing these tribes of oppressors and oppressed. The original Marxist analysis is, of course, about the class struggle. We see this kind of fragmenting into different kinds of oppression, but there are times and places where that seems to be very much at odds with this liberal kind of respect for the individual and recognition of us all as individuals.
As we talk about the SJW, which is usually tossed out as a pejorative, the social justice warrior, I look at my own life and I think, well, I'd like to think that I'm an advocate for social justice. I mean, I would like to see equal opportunity. I'd like to see unfair institutions, unfair policies, unfair realities changed for the better. I'd like to see humanism win the day, meaning that, we don't judge each other based on gender or race or any of those types of things, but we see each other as family members under the human condition. That's kind of a utopian way of looking at it. But
here,
when I hear social justice used in the negative context, it paints the picture of these sort of nasty malcontents, SJW, the pejorative exists for a reason and many people like to use it. It's a loaded term. Dr. Tarico, talk to me about social justice and your perspective on the social justice warrior.
Well, I think there is social justice, small s, small j, and then there's the capitalized brand, essentially, if you will, that is rooted in critical theory, critical oppression theory, and that basically has as its underpinnings a very specific kind of analysis of society that, when you buy into it, doesn't allow for a wide variety of approaches to thinking about the broader enterprise of social justice.
Well, let me stop you, if I may, for just a moment. Are you saying then that we're using capitals in this context, the social justice warrior that you're speaking about specifically, essentially is declaring that the institutions of our government, the way our society is set up, is front-loaded to favor one group and lock out everybody else. The whole system's kind of rigged. And that scenario is the source of most of, if not all of, society's ills. Is that a fair representation of what you were meaning?
It is an accurate way to say it,
okay,
to describe the theory. And the appealing part of that is that there is some truth in it, right? I think that the emergence of this perspective comes out of a good place. It comes out of frustration with the slow pace of change, that has come following the civil rights movement. I think it comes out of this sense that there are dynamics, the way that our history of bigotry of different kinds has gotten embedded in social institutions and in our legal system and in our habitual ways of perceiving things. There's reality to that, right? But then the second half of what you said is this, so that bigotry is there and it locks out everybody except this privileged few. It's so absolutist that there's not room for, again, we keep using these terms, nuance and complexity, right?
Please do. It's refreshing. Use them all you want.
So that you can't acknowledge that somebody might have a MAGA hat on for a different reason than being enthusiastically racist or even kind of blindly racist, right? You can't acknowledge that there are a variety of different priorities that might bring someone to do that. You can't acknowledge that people who are beaten down also have some ability to improve their own circumstances. God forbid you should talk about any individual autonomy, except, for example, when we're talking about, say, police officers who we have lots of freedom to kind of paint as bad eggs, as kind of character flawed, right? So there's this kind of twisted thing that if we look at young people, for example, who are coming out of communities that are struggling, young people of color who have gotten into gangs, for example, or people who have committed crimes, and those crimes are associated with poverty, we want to, on the left, blame the systems, blame structural kind of factors that have beaten them down. We recognize that circumstances around us can be horrendously powerful. And we want to talk about restorative justice and rehabilitation and forgiveness and giving people second chances and taking the time to meet people where they're at, even if they're not exactly where we wish they were at. And yet when we look at white men, for example, when we look at the governor of Virginia, or we look at Leon Nielsen, or whoever it might be, the attitude is very different. When we look at police officers who are violent and who do bad things, there's this very different attitude. And in fact, it's kind of the attitude that the religious right has traditionally taken, right? We perceive them as flawed, fatally flawed, and in need not of restitution or of support or moving forward from where they're at, but punishment.
Now, the second you talk about personal responsibility, this sort of purity cult immediately says, you sound like the Republican Party, you know, that mantra about rugged individualism and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and take responsibility for your own actions instead of blaming the system. I mean, they're not hearing that this is a complex web. There are a whole lot of gears in this machine. There are many people who are now just knee-jerking completely to the other side, and they've aligned you with the capital E enemy in this ideological war. And this is one of the challenges you and I face when trying to talk about these complex and nuanced issues. They're not mutually exclusive things. They can exist in the same reality.
Right. And so, you know, you can count me as one of the people who has said repeatedly, you can't bootstrap your way up if you don't have boots, right? You've got to have something to work with there. And that society is tremendously impactful in terms of who has the best shot possible in life. But, you know, these things, it's not either or.
I have the word woke in the title of this podcast. You have it in the title of your article. How would you define woke here in the 21st century? It's a word that gets tossed around a lot, but there may be some who are like, what's woke? What are we talking about? You want to sort of clarify for us?
When I used the word woke in my article, I was talking about a subset of progressive people who have decided that oppression is the key concept explaining the structure of society and the flow of history, and that virtually all human problems come from oppression.
When Dr. Hector Garcia and I were speaking recently about his book, Alpha God, we were talking about these evolved tendencies that may have helped us on the African savannah, but may not help us here in civilized 21st century society, right? And acknowledging why many of these things exist. And then you talk about them in a hopefully a fair way, and you see people split in the way that they do. He had mentioned that for some there might be what he calls a psychological priming effect, meaning there might be some people that just simply are sort of predisposed to be more extreme. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, this is well over my pay grade, but you tell me, you know, are some people just going to bend that direction and run further with it because of how they're wired?
Well, probably. I mean, the answer to that, I think, kind of is that's probably trivially true and maybe kind of significantly true. But the zeitgeist, kind of our sense of reality is socially constructed to a great degree. And I think that the zeitgeist and the communications technologies that are ascendant right now pull people in that direction, even when they have a fair bit of capacity for moderation under other circumstances.
This gets us into platforming, deplatforming. If you stand next to person X, if you are participating in an event with them, if you are in any way associated, if you're in their zip code, somehow you are a de facto endorser of who they are and what they do. And we're seeing many people who are waving the banner of the left, who are shouting down, who are heckling and shouting down people who are speakers in the arena of ideas. Is there speech? Are there speakers that should be denied a platform or just shouted off of one?
You know, Seth, I struggle with it. I think that words have consequences, and I think that there are kinds of speech that are legitimately harmful. and that we have some ability to discern that and to not give it a platform. But on the other hand, time and again, recently, there have been these incidents of deplatforming that I found troubling. So again, it's like there's this complexity, right? We're recognizing, I think a lot of people are really sensing the power of words and not knowing quite what to do with the fact that we have now learned how much free speech can be kind of twisted and abused. And on the other hand, as so many people have said, protections for free speech exist to safeguard unpopular speech. And so when I, in particular, see university systems deplatforming people, that somehow seems even more perverse than other places choosing not to give someone a microphone.
I mean, you can protest it civilly. You can be passionate protesters of the events. You can go outside. You can hold a counter event across the street. In a civilized society, without shouting them off the stage in that moment, there are ways to let your voice be heard and to counter bad ideas with better ideas.
And recently, a comment I made online that some people pushed back at is I think that what we need here is a little more humility, right? It's humility about whether or not we actually have the full story and what's going on. You know, people jump on what comes out in social media and make these assumptions that they know what's going on completely and that they therefore have a right to have an opinion about what someone else should do and how the situation should be resolved, even more so than a court of law would. That we need to have a little bit more humility about our own flaws and foibles and the fact that people who are in public office and in the public eye for other reasons also have their faults and foibles, that we need to have a little more humility about the fact that people can and do change and that the trajectory of a person's life maybe matters more than the kind of ugly things that they have done in the past. No, I wrote online that my history from age zero, we've been talking about this incident recently in the news of the Virginia governor appearing perhaps in this photograph or not. It's unclear. And, having admitted that he dressed up as Michael Jackson, even though there's all this horrible history of blackface being demeaning and degrading. And so I look at that and I'm like, well, so what was he? He was 25. Between the ages of 25, I was bulimic. I was depressed. I made a suicide attempt. I voted, I registered Republican and voted for Barry Goldwater. When I was a kid, I dressed up as an Indian squaw and loved that dress because I thought it was soft and beautiful. There are all kinds of things that I have been and done in my life that I look back on and I repudiate now. So I'm not in a position to cast the first stone. If I could, as a psychologist, let me do a little bit of self-analysis here, and then we can go back to some of the content of what we were talking about.
Sure.
I find that even as I talk about these things, I've got a sense of kind of a knot in my stomach that I'm going to say the wrong thing, that I have somehow failed to kind of express my view adequately to the point that someone can't take and twist my words out of context if what they're doing is assuming ill intent or wanting to kind of read what I say in the worst possible way. So I've done lots of interviews. I've never had that feeling before, even though I'm often being critical of institutions that a lot of people care about. And I think that says something about the very issue that we're trying to talk about.
I feel much the same. It's one of those things I feel compelled to address because I think it's the responsible thing. If I've got a broadcast that is popular and we've got people who I really do want to be a part of this conversation, I think the responsible thing to do is to lead by example and to not be the bad example of someone who's speaking with hyperbole and overstatement and vilification, and just let's come in and have a real conversation. I mean, this is supposed to be a show that is a conversation. It's interesting. You had mentioned who you were as a younger woman, and I was making a comment online in regard to the Covington Catholic school kids. They're there protesting the March for Choice, the Women's Rights March, and then you've got Nathan Phillips, a Native American veteran, and then you've got this other group, the Black Hebrew Israelites, and everybody's shouting, and most of the focus I noticed went on the kids. They're wearing the MAGA hats, right? And they're an easy target. And so, I was thinking about myself not all that long ago, and I wasn't a racist. I wasn't the worst person in the world, but I was a heavily indoctrinated evangelical young adult I was a kind of a pre-Tea Partier. I was Fox Newser. I was an Ann Coulter reading, Rush Limbaugh listening, Republican, kind of a Reaganite kid. I look at myself as a young person with some very unfortunate ideas, and I think I'm not ready to give up on Nick Sandmann. I'm not ready to write him off. I think I saw one tweet that said, let's ruin his life, or he does not deserve forgiveness. And I thought, what kind of a society do we live in where the people who are our ideological opponents, and in this case, he's just a punk kid. He's a snotty punk kid. Yeah, I shouldn't have been there. Yeah, there's a whole host of problems. But I don't want to see his life ruined. What I want is to see his thinking patterns, his reasoning, his ideas and values improve. I'd like to see him sort of rise with the tide. And I'm not seeing nearly enough of that. I mean, I know it's kind of utopian thought, but it was true for me. Why couldn't it be true for him, right?
Well, and when somebody gets beaten down or degraded in that way, that he was accused and vilified and threatened, the odds of him changing decrease. They don't increase.
Is the backfire effect real? I mean, does he double down in his mind and heart?
People have to feel safe in order to change. They need to be able to self-reflect, and you can't do that when you're half of a war.
You have now been declared the national villain.
Right.
So then he says, and I mean, the story may have evolved in ways that I'm not familiar with, but if he says, and I believe he said this, I would like to sit in a room and have a conversation with Nathan Phillips. And I, in my mind, think, okay, I mean, that works great for me. Even if they were diametrically opposed, let's sit him in a room and let's get these ideas and ideologies on the table, and let's kind of see what comes out in the wash. I mean, that would be fair, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that is how we learn and grow, right? But people can't do that when they're in a defensive crouch because they feel so attacked and threatened. It's not just true in our political life. It's true in our marriages. It's true in our friendships. It's true with our work colleagues, that when people become hostile and aggressive to each other, it makes it almost impossible for real listening to happen and real growth to happen.
I heard the saying that drama is sugar and the rest of us are flies. I feel like in the age of social media, that's so often true. Do you think social media is responsible for this kind of escalation, dehumanization, this, it's either me or you, right? If you're not with me, you're against me kind of thing?
I do think in large part, yes. I think that we don't fully understand what communications technologies are doing to us psychologically in terms of our kind of collective sense of what's real and what's important and how to treat each other. And what does seem to be particularly true is that social media, because it allows us to break into smaller and smaller groups of agreement, that we're losing our capacity to respect honest disagreement, to think that there could be different perspectives that are held in good conscience, and to have enough humility rather than certitude so that we carry the sense that we might not be 100% correct, or we might not have 100% of the picture. That is what it seems like we're losing.
But in this extremely polarized environment, if I try to extend an olive branch toward an ideological opponent, or if I'm charitable or generous or even kind, standing in the room with, perhaps even sharing a stage with someone who stands against my values, I failed the purity test. I am now tainted.
Yes, and I think that's where I come back to this article that I wrote recently, The Righteous and the Woke, because from evangelical Christianity, that stance sounds and feels so familiar, right? So there's all of these ways. What I was trying to do in that article was say, look, there are a number of ways in which this culture of righteousness on the left, it reminds me of evangelicalism. And one of them is that idea that, what is it that if you're kind of a lukewarm Christian, God's going to spit you out of his mouth or something, that the idea that it's almost worse to be lukewarm, and anybody who kind of holds a complicated perspective is perceived as lukewarm, that's worse than being outright evil.
Be neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm, and I will spew you out of my mouth. I've sort of heard this on the left, on the extreme left.
Yeah. And what I find myself thinking is like, I was thinking this morning, I'm not a centrist. I'm not in the center of almost any question you ask me about. But I do feel like, and you've heard me even in this show, that there are often complicated, countervailing causal factors and competing moral values in a lot of the problems that we're trying to solve. And that if we can't take those into account, if our map of reality is too simplistic and unilateral, then we're not really going to be able to solve problems because that's not how our world works.
I'm working on a presentation I'm going to be giving in the spring that deals with a lot of this, and I think people are kind of ready. In my own community, I'm sensing a backlash. People are tired. They're weary of all the drama and the fighting and the vilification. I mean, granted, yes, there are some who will always thrive. We can all think of people who they'll walk into a room and say, oh, it's too quiet and peaceful in here. Then immediately things go to shit. But I'm sensing a backlash, a cultural weariness, and a desire to de-escalate. Do I understand that you are starting to sense the same, Dr. Tarico?
Ooh, I wish I could say I was sensing it more than I am. So my experience is that in the secularism community, I am definitely experiencing that. I think that there are a fair number of people who, like you and I, have come out of religious traditions where people hold their beliefs. It's not just the content of beliefs, but the form of beliefs, how people hold those beliefs in a dogmatic way, in a fundamentalist way. And so people perceive that happening. When I look at the activist community around me that has been working for social justice, small s, small j, or for, kind of better education policy or better environmental policy or whatever it might be, I feel like people are still, if anything, continuing to escalate, that it hasn't crested yet. And I wonder if maybe it would be helpful to talk about the article that I wrote and that you kind of noticed had some specific ways in which people are holding these beliefs kind of in a fundamentalist way. It's not just the content of beliefs themselves, but it's how they're held and how they're treated and how that leads people to behave that is problematic. I wonder if we should talk about some of those.
Sure. I mean, if there's a specific angle or portion of the piece you'd like to dial in on, let's do that here. Well,
one thing that I find super noxious is the idea that denial is proof, right? So in evangelicalism, if you think you don't need to accept Jesus as your savior, that's proof that you do. And your denial just kind of shows how much you've hardened your heart and how blind you are to your own sinfulness, right? And I think that in woke culture, the same thing happens. It's this catch-22 where if you say, actually, I don't think I was acting out of racism there, that just kind of proves that you were. It's perceived. And if you're white in particular, then that's a sign of white.
Yeah, sure. That's just your privilege talking. Only somebody privileged would hold that position.
Exactly. It's an interesting bind that both ideologies put people in, that there's no way to question without that being perceived as confirmation. It's kind of like conspiracy theories work in that same way, right? Another aspect of this that you mentioned was the black and white thinking. If you're not with us, then you're against us, right? If you're not 1,000% with us, you're against us, I think is probably a more accurate way to frame it. Because in my mind, we can be mostly aligned. But if we're not completely and totally, absolutely aligned, then I have failed this purity test. That's right. And there are people online actually encouraging each other to shame and shun or kind of disconnect from people who disagree, right? That because why would you make common cause with a racist, right? So you go from someone disagrees to someone's a racist or a white supremacist or a neo-Nazi. And then you can, of course, then define people in ways where legitimately I think there is no common cause. But it's it's this process of starting with a small disagreement and ending up with that perception and then the shunning or shaming. And again, I find that familiar with what we saw within Christian communities where people self-censor because of shaming. And then if they make a break, if they take a principled stand and say, legitimately, I disagree here, that oftentimes the bottom line in the community is that if you don't take that back, you will get excommunicated or shunned.
Dr. Tarico, I know you'd sort of address the damn the sinner sort of a perspective when it comes to religion and to the woke. I mean, we live in a culture. I mean, you and I probably have the same generation, we didn't live in a time when every action and reaction, every meal we ate, every vacation we took, every opinion we had was a matter of public record. You know, you and I didn't have, for better and for worse, a chronicling of every success and failure and every dumbass thing we'd ever thought and done. We live in a time now when people are pouring through the Twitter feeds and sort of the life histories of everybody online to find a chink in the armor, to find an unfortunate action or idea. And no apology is good enough. You are a sinner and you deserve to be punished. You see this parallel among the religious, the fundamentally religious, and the fundamentally woke.
Yes. And you know how the church sometimes, in particular kind of tight fundamentalist churches, will push people to confess. There's this process of almost forcing confession from people.
Do your penance kind of thing, or?
Right. And penance. But, you know, there's this sort of thought policing thing that Maoist China did, that some conservative Christian groups do, where people are called into a room and basically forced to confess to their faults. And so what we've got, again, in woke culture is this idea that people are supposed to be self-confessional about their bigotry and that other people get to call you out on that.
It was a February article about actor Liam Neeson. And he comes forward and he talked about how, like 30-some years ago, I guess someone that he knew had been raped, and that he had purposefully gone out with the intent of murdering a black man. You know, essentially confessing to this horrible idea, this horrible perspective, this horrible person that he had been in the past. And appearances were canceled and opinions split on, you know, what do we do with this guy? Well, he's a racist. Well, no, he's saying that he used to be a racist and now he's coming clean and trying to speak honestly about that. And I think, you know, if this guy looks back and tries to address something that happened, some very candid moment, a very terrible thing that he had sort of harbored in his heart and mind, and to come forward and say, you know, back then I was a real son of a bitch, and this is kind of where that came from, there seems to be no room for forgiveness. So if they want people to come forward and be honest, but then they're going to crucify you for honesty, it seems like it's a no-win situation.
And in particular, you know, somebody commented online, we are asking men to be reflective and introspective about the things that are toxic within masculinity. I mean, we could ask the same thing of women about the things that are toxic in femininity, but right now the focus is on kind of the toxic masculinity thing. And we want people to get in touch with their feelings. We want them to do some self-analysis. We want them to kind of reflect on harms done and bad behaviors, right? And then we want to burn them at the stake when they do. That is not conducive to people taking the risk of being open and honest about either their faults or their history.
And you look at the context of this kind of stuff. I mean, Liam Neeson himself, you know, he's a product of the Northern Ireland in the 60s and 70s. I mean, talk about a volatile place. I mean, violence ruled the day. And, you know, he had a lot to sort of evolve out of. I heard a saying once that said that we tend to judge other people by their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. And sometimes, Dr. Tarico, I wish we would do a better job of trying to judge other people by their intentions. What were his intentions when he spoke so candidly about this thing?
One of the problems, if I can interrupt, in this kind of mental framework of woke culture is that intentions don't matter, only effects matter, right? So when you think about the microaggression issue, part of what's tricksy about it is that it redefines the word aggression, which has always implied intent, right? To kind of be, well, I felt harmed by that, and so therefore it was aggression, and then therefore I have the right to punch up or to hurt the person who aggressed against me. And it's the exact opposite of what we try to teach our kids when they're growing up, right?
Yeah.
You know, just because he hurt you doesn't mean he did it on purpose.
When I see someone saying that, well, if you wear a MAGA hat, you're a racist. Essentially a de facto racist, even if you were not a racist. Let's say you were a single issue voter. And there are people who live in these cocoons of ideas. We know the brain is very modular. Religion teaches this, right? People who believe the Bible is true but know nothing about it. People who hold to a specific dogma but really know nothing about it. people who said, well, Trump's pro-life or anti-choice or anti-abortion, he's my guy. And they can be totally unplugged from just about anything else, even willfully unplugged. Mm-hmm. The idea is, by putting on the MAGA hat, you have become part of a mechanism which promotes racism. So you as an individual are now racist.
Yes. And, so this idea that there's this insider jargon and kind of reworking of language, so one of the ways that critical theory redefines the term racism, or that members of woke culture have redefined it, is that it's kind of prejudice plus power, right? So as soon as you define it that way, then kind of what they say is, well, a person who's female can't be sexist, a person who's black can't be racist, et cetera, because they don't have the power to do that. And so no matter what they say, like no matter what ugly things a woman might say about men generally, or no matter what ugly things a black person might say about white people generally, that's not considered racism, because only structural racism counts as racism, only systemic racism counts as racism. But then the exact opposite that kind of makes my mind want to blow up is that we constantly accuse people of racism as individuals, including when, in the circumstance that you just described, well, I don't even know what you think or what you feel or what might make you put that hat on, but you're by definition a racist. And it's an individual character thing, and it doesn't have anything to do with whether you have power or don't have power.
What do we do now? I mean, the gorilla's out of its cage. The social media machine is giving everybody and their dog the opportunity to feel superior by making others feel inferior, or at least amplifying their inferiority of ideas. How do we de-escalate?
I come back again to this question of humility. I think, humility about how much we actually know about the stories that come out in the media, and whether we are in a position to have a definitive opinion about what someone has done or what their motives are or what should happen to them. Humility about our own imperfections and the ongoing imperfections of other people. Humility about our past and the fact that growth is a struggle for each and every person. And then humility about the fact that honestly decent people can have differences of opinion, and that they can hold those differences of opinion in good faith as moral beings. How easy is that to do? I don't know how easy it is to actually promote humility, but I think that's part of what we're trying to do here in this conversation.
Maybe we just start with ourselves and those around us, and maybe it starts to become like a pay it forward kind of thing. I don't know. That's the optimist in me, Valerie. You know what I'm saying? I
think what I find myself sometimes wanting to do is to create an aversion to this kind of righteous fundamentalist attitude, so that becomes uncomfortable, and people find it less easy to slip into that, even when they're concerned about social issues, right? So this idea that there's two kinds of people, righteous and infidels, the idea that some people are just born bad, like white males are born privileged, and that's kind of an original sin that there's nothing they can do about but shut up and keep apologizing, right? This idea that there are kind of orthodoxies, that there are kind of right ways to interpret things, and that there's no room for discussion about that. All of this kind of stuff that we've been talking about, what I hope to do by writing about it is to create some sense of awareness and aversion, so that when people catch themselves in those kinds of behaviors, they can back off a bit.
If it's okay, with your permission, I'm going to take a short break. I'd like to come back, and I'm going to read the article, The Righteous and the Woke, Why Evangelicals and Social Justice Warriors Trigger Me in the Same Way. If you're cool, I'm just going to read the whole thing for the listening audience. Would that be all right with you?
That works for me. Thank you much.
You betcha. All right, we'll do that in just a second. Dr. Valerie Tarico, so glad to call you friend, and so glad for a reasonable and empathetic and compassionate voice in these often binary shouting matches out there. It's just really been, I think, hopefully for our listeners as well, a kind of a cathartic and educational conversation about how we might be able to fix the problems and come together as human beings. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on the show and for taking on such a difficult topic.
Oh, I didn't have nearly enough hate mail, this month, so I figured, let's just talk about this. That'll be fun. Dr. Tarico, I'll send everybody to your website, and thanks again, okay?
Have a good afternoon.
All right, give me just a second. I'll be right back, and we'll do the thing. Hang on. Have you ever heard of the halo effect? I'm talking about something that neuroscience calls exaggerated emotional coherence. In other words, our brains tend to oversimplify things, so we make a judgment about a person or an idea without really having all the information. And our brains are really good at shortcuts. Those shortcuts are really necessary. They're helpful because it's impossible to deep research everything that comes at us. But when we make a judgment like this with a few facts, or we have confirmation bias or make assumptions, we so often get ourselves into trouble. Well, psychologist and Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman is author of a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And Blinkist has the major points of this book streamlined down to 19 minutes in digital print and audio format, meaning that you can learn about the brain and System 1 and System 2 processes of the brain, and you can do it in a single sitting or on a single drive or a 20-minute walk around the block. Blinkist is the only app that gives you the key takeaways from thousands of nonfiction books. I finished Thinking Fast and Slow on a drive downtown. The whole book. Imagine getting Carlo Rovelli's 7 brief lessons on physics and doing it in about 15 minutes. Our Inner Ape by Franz de Waal in 24 minutes. The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris, blinked down to 15 minutes. It's a hugely diverse library on a huge variety of subjects. And right now, for a limited time, Blinkist has a special offer just for my audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Seth to start your free 7-day trial. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist. Blinkist.com/Seth to start your free 7-day trial. Blinkist.com/Seth. Appreciate you listening to the broadcast and being a part of the Thinking Atheist community. I know that sometimes, even in meritorious movements, even when we're fighting for right things, when we are on the side of goodness, sometimes we see some untoward behavior, some untoward attitudes, at least unhelpful attitudes. I think it's dishonest not to address those things. Or we say that, well, the other camp's imperfections are so much greater than ours, we completely ignore ours, which seems to be the case many times because there's a whataboutery, right? Well, what about their camp? What about all the awful stuff they're doing? It's tons worse than the stuff that we're doing. I can already hear the people who are assuming and freaking out that I'm making a false equivalency argument. I'm not saying that their problems are equivalent to our problems and vice versa, right? I'm not saying that we're just as bad as they are, because as someone who holds liberal values, I'm not remotely convinced that's the case. But if they have a whole city on fire, burning to the ground, and we have, I don't know, let's say a neighborhood on fire, those problems are not equivalent, but it's also stupid to not acknowledge we have a neighborhood on fire and we probably should do something about it. This is a problem that probably should be addressed. That seems simple enough on the surface, and yet so often people eagerly miss this point. And I don't want my ideological opponents being the only ones talking about the problem. I don't want them to own the narrative. Look, if you're in a vessel and it's a worthy vessel, but it has some leaks, it has a few problems that need to be fixed, I would like to be the one to fix those from within. And that is the purpose of conversations like this. And already I lament in my heart just a little bit, because I know there are people who didn't even really listen to the show. They just saw the title and they heard maybe a few sentences at the beginning during the monologue or whatever, and they just knee-jerk themselves into a froth of righteous indignation, throw gasoline on every tiny spark, and then in the very way that we've been speaking about here on the broadcast just a few minutes ago, declare that there's a traitor. There's someone in our midst who is not towing the line, someone who has the gall to criticize us of all people, we the righteous, we who are on the side of good, we who are doing battle against the worst people in the world. It makes me sad. I just feel a little overwhelmed sometimes. And I just wish we would be a little more human in our encounters with other human beings. This is an article by Dr. Valerie Tarico. It was posted on the 24th of January, 2019. It's linked in the description box, so you'll have the print version if you want it. It's called The Righteous and the Woke, Why Evangelicals and Social Justice Warriors Trigger Me in the Same Way. Dr. Tarico's article says, I was born again until nearly the end of graduate school, a sincere evangelical who went to church on Sunday and Wednesday with my family and to Thursday Bible study on my own. I dialed for converts during the I Found It evangelism campaign, served as a counselor at Camp Good News, and graduated from Wheaton College, Billy Graham's alma mater. I know what it is to be an earnest believer among believers. I also know what it is to experience those same dynamics from the outside. Since my fall from grace, I've written a book, Trusting Doubt, and several hundred articles exposing harms from evangelicalism, not just the content of beliefs, but also how they spread and shape the psychology of individuals and behavior of communities, doing damage in particular to women, children, and religious minorities. It occurred to me recently that my time in evangelicalism and subsequent journey out have a lot to do with why I find myself reactive to the spread of woke culture among colleagues, political soulmates, and friends. Christianity takes many forms, with evangelicalism being one of the more single-minded, dogmatic, groupish, and enthusiastic among them. The woke, meaning progressives who have awoken to the idea that oppression is the key concept explaining the structure of society, the flow of history, and virtually all of humanity's woes, share these qualities. To a former evangelical, something feels too familiar. Or better said, a bunch of somethings feel too familiar. And she lists some specifics. Righteous and infidels. There are two kinds of people in the world, saved and damned, or woke and bigots, and anyone who isn't with you is against you. Through the lens of dichotomizing ideologies, each of us is seen, first and foremost, not as a complicated individual, but as a member of a group with moral weight attached to our status as an insider or outsider, with exceptions made for potential converts. There is insider jargon. Like many other groups, the saved and the woke signal insider status by using special language. An evangelical immediately recognizes a fellow tribe member when he or she hears phrases like praise the Lord, born again, backsliding, stumbling block, give a testimony, a harvest of souls, or it's not a religion, it's a relationship. The woke signal their wokeness with words like intersectionality, cultural appropriation, trigger warning, microaggression, privilege, fragility, problematic, or decolonization. Jargon isn't merely a tool for efficient or precise communication, as it is in many professions. It is a sign of belonging and moral virtue. Born that way. Although theoretically anyone is welcome in either group, the social hierarchies in both evangelical culture and woke culture are defined largely by accidents of birth. The Bible lists privileged bloodlines, the chosen people, and teaches that men, more so than women, were made in the image of God. In woke culture, hierarchy is determined by membership in traditionally oppressed tribes, again based largely on bloodlines and chromosomes. Note that this is not about individual experience of oppression or privilege, hardship or ease. Rather, generic average oppression scores get assigned to each tribe and then to each person based on intersecting tribal identities. Thus, a queer female East Indian Harvard grad with a PhD and ED position is considered more oppressed than the unemployed third son of a white Appalachian coal miner. Original sin. In both systems, one consequence of birth is inherited guilt. People are guilty of the sins of their fathers. In the case of evangelicalism, we are all born sinful, deserving of eternal torture because of Eve's folly, eating from the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. In woke culture, white and male people are born with blood guilt, a product of how dominant white and male people have treated other people over the ages in modern times, which, it must be said, often has been beyond unspeakably horrible. Again, though, individual guilt isn't about individual behaviors. A person born with original sin or blood guilt can behave badly and make things worse, but they cannot erase the inborn stain. Note that this contradicts core tenets of liberal, humanist, and traditional progressive thought. There are orthodoxies. The Bible is the inerrant word of God. Jesus died for your sins. Hell awaits sinners. Salvation comes through accepting Jesus as your Savior. If you are an evangelical, doctrines like these must not be questioned. Trust and obey, for there's no other way. Anyone who questions core dogmas commits heresy, and anyone who preaches against them should be deplatformed or silenced. The woke also have tenets of faith that must not be questioned. Most, if not all, ills flow from racism or sexism. Only males can be sexist. Only white people can be racist. Gender is culturally constructed and independent of sex. Immigration is an economic boon for everyone. Elevating the most oppressed person will solve problems all around. Did my challenging that list make you think you might be reading an article by a conservative? If so, that's exactly what I'm trying to illustrate. Denial as proof. In evangelicalism, thinking you don't need to accept Jesus as your Savior is proof that you do. Your denial simply reveals the depth of your sin and hardness of heart. In woke culture, any pushback is perceived as a sign of white fragility, or worse, a sign that one is a racist, sexist, homophobe, Islamophobe, xenophobe, or transphobe. You say that you voted for Barack Obama, and your kids are biracial, so your problem with BLM, Black Lives Matter, isn't racism? LOL, that's just what a racist would say. In both cultures, the most charitable interpretation that an insider can offer a skeptic is something along these lines. You seem like a decent, kind person. I'm sure that you just don't understand. Since evangelical and woke dogmas don't allow for honest, ethical disagreement, the only alternative hypothesis is that the skeptic must be an evildoer or bigot. Black and white thinking. If you are not for us, you're against us. In the evangelical worldview, we are all caught up in a spiritual war between the forces of God and Satan, which is playing out on the celestial plane. Who's on the Lord's side, one hymn asks, because everyone else is on the other. Even mainline Christians, and especially Catholics, may be seen by evangelicals as part of the enemy force. For many of the woke, the equivalent of mainline Christians are old-school social liberals, like women who wear pink pussy hats. Working for colorblindness, for example, is not just considered a suboptimal way of addressing racism, which is a position that people can make arguments for. Rather, it is itself a symptom of racism, and there's no such thing as a moderate conservative. Both evangelicals and the woke argue that tolerance is bad. One shouldn't tolerate evil or fascism, they say, and most people would agree. The problem is that so many outsiders are considered either evil sinners or racist fascists. In this view, pragmatism and compromise are signs of moral taint. Shaming and shunning. The woke don't tar, feather, and banish sinners, nor do they determine guilt by throwing bound people into bodies of water to see if they float like bad eggs, guilty, or sink like good people should. Neither, mercifully, do Christian Puritans anymore. But public shaming and trial by ordeal are used by both clans to keep people in line. Some Christian leaders pressure members into ritual public confession. After all, as theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, nothing can be more cruel than the leniency which abandons others to their sin. Shaming and shunning have ancient roots as tools of social control, and they elevate the status of the person or group doing the shaming. Maoist struggle sessions, forced public confessions, and Soviet self-criticism are examples of extreme shaming in social critical movements seeking to upend traditional power structures. So it should be no surprise that some of the woke show little hesitation when call-out opportunities present themselves, nor that they remain unrelentingly righteous, even when those call-outs leave a life or a family in ruins. Selective science denial. Disinterest in inconvenient truths, or worse, denial of inconvenient truths, is generally a sign that ideology is at play. Most of us on the left can rattle off a list of truths that evangelicals find inconvenient. The Bible is full of contradictions. Teens are going to keep having sex. Species evolve. The earth is 4.5 billion years old. Climate change is caused by humans, which suggests that God doesn't have his hand on the wheel. Prayer works at best at the margins of statistical significance. But evidence and facts can be just as inconvenient for the woke. Gender dimorphism affects how we think, not just how we look. Personal responsibility has real-world benefits, even for people who have the odds stacked against them. Lived experience is simply anecdotal evidence. Skin color is often a poor proxy for privilege. Organic foods won't feed 11 billion. Evangelism. As infectious ideologies, evangelicalism and woke culture rely on both paid evangelists and enthusiastic converts to spread the word. CRU, C-R-U, formerly Campus Crusade for Christ, and related organizations spend tens of millions annually seeking converts on college campuses. But many outreach activities are led by earnest student believers. Critical oppression theory on campus has its epicenter in gender and race studies, but has become a mainstay in schools of public health and law, as well as the liberal arts. Once this becomes the dominant lens for human interactions, students police themselves and each other. Nobody wants to be the ignoramus who deadnames a transgender peer or microaggresses against a foreign student by asking about their culture. Hypocrisy. Christianity bills itself as a religion centered in humility. But countervailing dogmas promote the opposite. It's hard to imagine a set of beliefs more arrogant than the following. The universe was designed for humans. We uniquely are made in the image of God. All other creatures are ours to consume. Among thousands of religions, I happen to be born into the one that's correct. The creator of the universe wants a personal relationship with me. Where evangelicalism traffics in hubris cloaked as humility, woke culture traffics in discrimination cloaked as inclusion. The far left demands that hiring practices, organizational hierarchies, social affinity groups, political strategizing, and funding flow give primacy to race and gender. Some of the woke measure people by these checkboxes, to a degree matched in the West only by groups like the MRAs, the men's rights activists, and white supremacists. The intent is to rectify old wrongs and current inequities, to literally solve discrimination with discrimination. One result is disinterest in suffering that doesn't derive from traditional structural oppression of one tribe by another. And finally, gloating about the fate of the wicked. One of humanity's uglier traits is that we like it when our enemies suffer. Some of the great Christian leaders and great justice warriors of history have inspired people to rise higher. Think Desmond Tutu, Elie Wiesel, Václav Havel, Nelson Mandela. But neither evangelicalism nor woke culture consistently inspires members to transcend tribal vindictiveness because neither, at heart, calls members into our shared humanity. Some Christian leaders have actually proclaimed that the suffering of the damned in hell heightens the joy of the saved in heaven. Some of the woke curse those they see as fascists to burn in the very same Christian hell, metaphorically if not literally. They dream of restorative justice for criminal offenses, but lifelong, ruinous retribution for political sinners. Those hateful, Racist Trump voters deserve whatever destitution or illness may come their way. Unemployed young men in rural middle America are turning to heroin? Too bad. Nobody did anything about the crack epidemic. Oil Town is on fire? Burn, baby, burn. I know how compelling those frustrated, vengeful thoughts can be, because I've had them. But I think that progressives can do better. Ideology has an awe-inspiring power to forge identity and community, direct energy, channel rage and determination, love and hate. It has been one of the most transformative forces in human history, but too often, ideology in the hands of a social movement simply rebrands and redirects old self-centering impulses while justifying the sense that this particular fight is uniquely holy. Even so, social movements and religions, including those that are misguided, usually emerge from an impulse that is deeply good, the desire to foster well-being in a world that is more kind and just, one that brings us closer to humanity's multi-millennial dream of broad, enduring peace and bounty. This, too, is something that the righteous and the woke have in common. Both genuinely aspire to societal justice, small s, small j, meaning not the brand, but the real deal. Given that they often see themselves at opposite ends of the spectrum, perhaps that is grounds for a little hope. Thanks again to Dr. Valerie Tarico for having this conversation with me and sharing the article. It's something to chew on, something to consider. Certainly it needs to be a part of the conversations we're having out there as we define what is appropriate and inappropriate in our responses to the injustices and wrongs in society and how to fix them. And thanks to you as well. Thanks for listening. Thanks for lending your reasonable voice to a hopefully growing community of reasonable voices out there as we work together to see the good ideas defeat the bad ideas, to help change minds for the better, to help eliminate discrimination, bigotry, suffering, oppression, injustice. And we try as best we can to look over the walls of our particular tribe to see humanity, the human condition, and the human family. Have a wonderful week, my friends. I'll see you next time.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming free thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.